I had always liked the sharp, brittle air of late fall, how it clarified the world, stripped it down to shapes and bones. That year I chose a stretch of the trail in Pennsylvania that locals murmured about with a kind of reverence. Narrow paths that threaded through old hardwoods, low ridgelines where the wind carried the river's voice, long corridors of root and stone. I picked a weekday and went alone because solitude is part of how I hike. There's a particular clarity to being the only breathing thing on a long ribbon of earth. Fewer people, fewer distractions, fewer witnesses too, but I didn't think about that last part when I laced my boots and walked out. The trail hugged a small river for a while, a narrow ribbon that kept time with the sky. Water and trees, the trail itself a worn stitch through the undergrowth simple geometry that usually settles the head. I walked with a pack that had known other miles, the straps rubbing familiar maps into my shoulders. At some point the rhythm of steps and breath and water folded into me, and I found a flat-faced boulder by the bank and sat. My Gatorade was warm because my hands were cold. The world tasted like damp pine and old rocks. Then I heard it, a single, far-off cry that snagged the edge of my hearing. At first I thought the river had thrown a note of sound rising current makes odd noises, but the cry was unmistakable. It was a baby, small and urgent, something a long way from any nursery. It came from deeper down the trail, the direction I planned to walk. For a minute I sat with the empty air around me, listening the way you listen to a distant car engine trying to start. The sound didn't swell as I stood up. It stayed the same distance away, the same thin, insistent wail. I shouldn't have gone after it. I knew what logic said. The woods carry noise oddly, and people loop back. Sometimes hikers have crying babies or phones playing a loop of a ringtone, but logic is a poor companion when some small voice is calling for help. I walked fast, then faster, the trail uneasily familiar under my shoes. As I moved, the cry seemed to drift ahead of me, always a step or two further down the path. I lengthened my stride, then broke into a run, ankles working over roots, breath leaving white flags in the cold. For 30 seconds it felt like a chase. I would close the gap. The sound would not only refuse to swell, but would seem to recalibrate, as if someone were sliding the note forward on purpose. After half a minute of that awkward, panicked speed, I stopped. The sound stopped too abruptly, as if someone had reached down and pinched the world's volume. I waited, chest hollowed out from exertion. The river kept talking to itself. Leaves whispered in the treetops. Nothing else. For a few minutes I recorded short clips on my phone. Dumb little evidence I could post later to prove I wasn't losing it. The battery on my camera read full. My confidence did not. The forest has a way of making you smaller than you are, and in that space the idea that there might be a kid alone out here felt enormous and impossible. Then footsteps came. Someone was moving quickly toward me from the direction where the crying had last been audible. I clenched the pack straps until my knuckles hurt, expecting a parent throwing themselves into a run, a flustered face and a stroller, anything to make the scene ordinary again. What appeared instead was a woman, thin hair plastered to her cheeks by cold sweat, expression raw with panic. She came at me so suddenly that she swallowed the space between us and stopped 2 steps from my boots, breathing like a runner at the end of a sprint. "Have you seen my baby?" she asked, voice like glass on gravel. Up close she smelled of river water and something metallic. She didn't wait for my reaction. She grabbed my sleeve and jerked me along the trail toward the place I'd been chasing the sound from. Her fingers were small and tight, and when I glanced back to make sure she was still there, I could feel the adrenaline like a live wire in my veins. We moved fast, calling out, searching the brush and hollows while my brain ran through the practical checklist. Call park rangers. Call 911. Carry a small child out of here. The trail scraped our boots. The river hummed the same indifferent tune. After a minute, I realized the woman had gone completely still. No footsteps, no breathy panting. I spun around to ask if she'd seen something when I noticed she was gone. Not a few paces ahead or behind. Gone. A prick of cold crawled along my spine. For a second I thought she had ducked off the path to dig into the roots, looking for the child. But the trees there were dense and worn. I would have seen her shoulders, a flash of jacket. Instead I found space, just empty trail and the river's steady sound. So I called out her name, tried the simplest, least suspicious shout, "Ma'am," and waited while my voice folded into the forest. Only birds answered, somewhere high in the canopy and the river. Fear has a peculiar geometry. It makes sound fold the wrong way. It makes distance ambiguous. I walked back the way we'd come, the path under my feet suddenly foreign. Across the bank, a figure stood motionless on a low, gravelly shelf by the opposite shore. The woman, arms hanging loose at her sides, face blank as if time had painted the expression in 2 strokes and left it. She looked at me with an intensity that felt like being observed through a lens. No plea, no waving, just the fixed, quiet stare of someone turned into a statue. For reasons I could not fully explain, I did not approach her. The river made a small, steady noise that sounded like a soft exhale. I walked away because the sensible part of me, thin as it was, argued that whoever she was, whoever had taken that sound, was now in a trance or playing a strange game. So I left. I walked until my calves burned, took a detour loop, and came back to my car with the trail behind me, looking like something that belonged to another life. I think what shook me most wasn't the sight of a stranger standing unmoving across the water. It was the fact that the crying had never been resolved, that the trail offered no neat answer. The moment stayed with me, small and jagged like a stone in a shoe. Sometimes at home, hours later, I replayed the audio on my phone and tried to convince myself the sound had been an animal or a toy left on a trash heap. But there was a cadence to the cry, the human quickness of it, the way my muscles tightened when it failed to come closer. I cut that hike short and told myself I would return another time, with friends, with witnesses. Even now I wonder if anyone else had a run-in like mine, if some corner of the trail keeps a trickster's echo, or if I passed someone who had been practicing a cruelty I could not yet imagine. The drive back home should have been a relief, but the highway lights seemed too dim, the car too quiet. My mind kept replaying that moment by the river, her arms hanging lifelessly at her sides, her face vacant, watching me without moving. It wasn't just the sight that haunted me. It was the absence of anything normal. No words, no gestures, no explanation. Just silence. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I searched forums, scrolled through hiking blogs, even typed Appalachian Trail strange experiences into Google like a desperate teenager. There were stories, always vague, always secondhand, about phantom noises, about the crying child. A few people mentioned hearing babies in places where no family should have been. Some claimed it was an old trick used by predators to lure hikers deeper into the woods. Others swore it was something older, something that belonged to the mountains themselves. None of it made me feel better. At night, when the wind rattled the siding of my apartment, I'd swear I heard faint cries buried under the noise. Once, walking home from work past an alley, I stopped cold because I thought I heard the same baby's wail echoing between dumpsters. When I turned, the alley was empty. My rational brain said it was in my head, but my body didn't believe it. My skin prickled, my chest tightened, and I walked faster until I was home with the lights on. 2 weeks later, I told myself I was being ridiculous. The trail had just spooked me, that was all. I bought a new set of boots, packed my gear, and decided to test myself. A different section of the Appalachian, still in Pennsylvania but closer to town. This time there were more hikers. A steady trickle of couples and solo walkers who nodded as we passed. Their presence helped. For a while, the trail was only what it was meant to be. Mud, roots, breath, sky. But solitude has a way of finding you. By late afternoon, the path thinned of company, and I found myself alone again. The forest darkened earlier than it should have, the shadows long and uneasy. I stopped for water at a clearing where the trees bent inward like ribs. The silence pressed on me. And then, just as before, I heard it. A baby crying. This time it came from behind me, from the section of trail I had already walked. The hairs on my neck lifted, because I knew there hadn't been anyone there when I passed. I froze, bottle in hand, and waited. The crying grew louder, closer, as though someone were walking toward me but refusing to come into view. I forced myself to turn around. No one was there. But when I glanced down, right at the edge of the dirt path, I saw something small and wrong, the imprint of bare feet. Tiny ones, like a child's. They pressed into the soft mud, fresh enough to still glisten with moisture. The forest around me held its breath. The prints trailed off into the undergrowth, vanishing a few yards into the tangle of roots and leaves. I crouched down, staring at them, and a rush of cold air spilled over my shoulders as though the forest itself was leaning closer to see what I'd do. My mouth was dry, my chest tight. Bare feet. Out here, in the cold. Logic begged me to leave it alone, to turn back toward the parking lot and never look behind me again. But something deeper, a mix of dread and stubborn curiosity, pushed me forward. I stepped off the trail, crunching through leaves, following the faint indentations until the ground hardened and the marks disappeared. That's when I heard it again. Not a baby this time. A woman's voice. It was faint, urgent, slipping between the trees. "Have you seen my baby?" The exact same words as before. I froze, my heart punching so hard against my ribs that it almost drowned her out. The sound came from ahead, deeper into the woods. Slowly, I lifted my phone and flicked on the flashlight. A pale beam cut through the darkness, carving thin shapes from the trees. My light landed on a figure standing 20 feet away. It was her. The same woman from before. Same lank hair, same hollow eyes, same expressionless face. She didn't move toward me, didn't even blink, just stood with her arms hanging limp at her sides. I whispered, "What do you want?" But my voice shook too much to sound like mine. For a moment I thought she wouldn't respond. Then, with a sudden, violent crack of branches, she tilted her head, impossibly sharp, as though her neck had been yanked by a string. The motion was so abrupt it made my stomach flip. And then, all at once, the baby's cry began again, this time right behind me. I spun, light swinging wildly, catching only trees, leaves, shadows. The wail was piercing. Just feet away, I turned back to the woman, and she was gone. The clearing was empty. My light fell on nothing but the glint of water through the trees. But the crying didn't stop. It moved, circling me, always just out of sight. Panic finally broke my paralysis. I stumbled back to the trail, nearly dropping my phone, and began walking fast, then running, lungs searing with cold air. The crying followed, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, until my legs shook and the world collapsed into a single frantic rhythm. Footsteps, breath, the endless wail of something that couldn't possibly be there. I didn't stop until I burst into the small gravel lot where my car waited, the sun already bleeding out behind the trees. The crying cut off the instant my hand touched the door handle. Silence fell so completely that it rang in my ears. I sat in the driver's seat with the locks engaged, engine running, staring at the trailhead. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then, just as I shifted into reverse, I saw her, standing at the tree line, arms limp, head tilted, watching. She stood in the fading light like a smudge on reality, too still, too sharp around the edges, as if the forest itself was holding its breath to keep her in place. Her face was pale in the gloom, eyes black and depthless. I couldn't move. My hands clamped to the wheel, trembling, while the engine idled loud enough to drown out the river, but not loud enough to erase the sight of her. Her lips parted. I couldn't hear words, only the faint shape of them, mouthed over and over. My chest tightened. I didn't need sound to know what she was saying. "Have you seen my baby?" The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth into my car. And with it came another sound, faint, delicate, like bare feet slapping against wet ground. I jerked my eyes to the gravel just outside my headlights. Tiny prints appeared one by one, fresh and glistening, as though someone invisible was walking slowly toward me. That was it. I threw the car into reverse so fast the tires screamed against the gravel. My headlights swung wildly across the trees, but she was gone. No figure at the edge of the lot. No pale face in the shadows. I didn't check twice. I floored it down the road until the forest finally spat me back into the weak safety of the town's streetlights. At home, I told myself it had been exhaustion, paranoia, maybe even hypothermia creeping into my brain after hours of cold hiking. But my boots told a different story. When I unlaced them in the entryway, there were faint smears of mud pressed into the leather mud, shaped like the prints I'd seen forming outside my car. too small to be mine, too fresh to dismiss. Now, whenever I hike, I do it only with friends, and never near that stretch of Pennsylvania trail again. Yet sometimes, when the woods fall too quiet, I catch myself holding my breath, listening for the faint wail of something small, or the rasp of a voice behind me. And at night, when sleep is shallow, I dream of a woman standing motionless across a river, arms hanging lifelessly, waiting for me to answer a question I can never afford to.